Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 31, The Carolingian Renaissance. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the release of Aratus's son Grimoald ensured the failure of an imperial invasion of southern Italy. Since Saxony and northern Italy were stable, Charles decided that it was time to annex nearby Bavaria, even though the duchy was not a threat to the Frankish kingdom. Actually, the annexation of a stubbornly independent duchy was merely the first step in a large-scale expansion east. The real target was the lands controlled by the Avars, fierce nomads who lived east of Bavaria. After careful preparation, Charles led several armies deep into Avar territory, but was forced to retreat when his supply chain became dangerously stretched. Still, Charles merely postponed his invasion and remained in Bavaria to plan the next campaign. The Frankish kingdom had expanded greatly since Charles became king. Remember, the conquest of Aquitaine had only been completed a few months before Charles's father Pippin had died. Then Charles had conquered the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy, subjugated the Saxons, and annexed Bavaria. So, how was this very, very large kingdom governed? The massive amount of land and treasure looted from the Lombards and the Saxons gave Charles a near limitless ability to give treasure and estates in newly conquered lands to lords, dioceses, and monasteries as a reward for their support. However, Charles recognized that support was not guaranteed forever. Therefore, most of the land grants to nobles and churchmen were benefices, basically temporary grants. Nobles could pass them on to their sons, but only if they had retained royal favor. Since Charles gave huge tracts of land to his followers, those estates had the resources to employ more efficient farming techniques, especially the three-field system of crop rotation and plows that required at least 2 oxen, but produced higher yields, thus enabling more people to be fed, increasing the number of subjects. Even so, bad weather would cause famine, which might reflect a failure to store enough food. Since people lived largely on diets of bread and porridge, there was not much room for error. More important, transportation still depended on rivers, so food could not easily be sent to famine-struck areas. Also, a steady stream of conquests required a well-trained army, so free men were required to spend time training rather than working on their farms. The Frankish kingdom did not have an actual capital. Since Charles spent much of the year preparing and then leading the annual campaign against whoever he was trying to conquer, the capital would be wherever he was at the moment. Charles had hundreds, if not thousands, of estates, and over 100 were proper residences, spaced out to provide reliable and comfortable places to stay when he traveled around the kingdom. The winter was often spent at Aachen because of its spas. Since Charles focused much of his time on the annual campaigns, he obviously did not have time to travel around his large and growing kingdom. Instead, he relied on roughly 40 to 50 families of powerful aristocrats, largely drawn from the old aristocracy of Austrasia and given new lands in the newly conquered areas. These families retained their existing lands in the heart of Frankia, which made them loyal as long as there was a strong central ruler. Postal stations and way stations built by the Romans had disappeared, so roads were badly maintained. Since Charles traveled with a huge entourage, he usually stayed at royal palaces, but most of those were located in Frankia itself. So bishops and monasteries would have to feed the royal entourage in regions like Aquitaine and Italy. Recognizing that the massive expansion of his kingdom required an improved system of local government, Charles had divided each newly conquered region into counties. This process began with the Lombards in 776 and continued with Aquitaine in 778, Thuringia in 780, Saxony in 782, and finally Bavaria in 788. Since the counts were expected to cooperate with the local bishop, the counties in Gaul and Italy were usually equal to the boundaries of the bishop's diocese. However, more recently, Christianized regions like Saxony would have several counties located within a single bishopric. Regions on the border required more coordination than a single count, so border regions would be led by a prefect with several counties under his control. For example, Count Gerald, Charles's brother-in-law, became prefect of Bavaria after Duke Tassilo was sent to a monastery. In the end, the simplest way to integrate new regions into the Frankish kingdom was to replace local leaders with Franks, which was standard practice under Charles. The counts were not feudal landowners, but royal appointees responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, administering justice, raising troops, and leading them to take part in campaigns. The position of count was usually assigned to a wealthy landowner in the region, but the families did not have the exclusive right to the position. A key responsibility of the counts was to oversee the judicial sessions held 3 times a year, assisted by a group of legal experts. While the count's responsibilities regarding tax collection and raising troops for campaigns are pretty self-explanatory, the count's other responsibility as a judge requires a bit of explanation. Charles's father Pippin had decreed that every man should be tried by the laws of his land, and Charles maintained this policy. By this time, the inhabitants of Nuestria viewed themselves as Franks, the residents of Aquitaine as Romans, and the people in the Kingdom of Italy as Lombards. Evidence that the massive kingdom was evolving into a collection of countries with their own separate languages and legal systems. Actually, the legal process must have been complex, since Franks were emigrating to the newly conquered lands and they would be subject to Frankish law, not Roman law, if they had moved to Aquitaine. If they were involved in a legal dispute with a resident of Aquitaine who followed Roman law, it would have been a challenge for the local judge, who would have to decide which legal system would apply. Apparently, these challenges became a serious problem since Charles decided to standardize the many individual legal systems that were an entrenched part of local culture. In 788, a number of leading clerics were brought to Aachen to spend the winter producing a capitulary on laws and morality. Once the scholars had completed their task, Charles held an assembly in the Meuse Valley, the home of his dynasty, and introduced the Admonitio Generalis, a set of laws for the church and the state, basing the secular laws as punishments for sinning against God. Aside from legal reforms, Charles valued knowledge. The number of intellectuals in Charles's court had first increased after he conquered Lombardy, as the leading scholars of the Italian peninsula gravitated to the source of wealth needed to support their research. As the kingdom expanded, Charles employed his wealth to lure famous scholars from other courts, generally from the Lombard kingdom, Aquitaine, refugees from Muslim Spain, Irishmen, and even some Englishmen. Furthermore, he made a serious effort to find rare books in libraries and have them copied so they could be distributed to monasteries, thus spreading knowledge. I need to stress that Charles's interest in learning was not a personal interest, but rather an organized effort to improve the level of knowledge in the kingdom. The most influential scholar was Alcuin, a product of the Celtic revival of Christianity, who had spent most of his life in York, Northumbria, but had traveled to the continent occasionally, where he had met the king in 781 when Charles was in Rome. Impressed by the English monk, the Frankish king invited him to manage the palace school at Aachen. Alcuin was happy to remain on the continent rather than return to England, which admittedly had an abundance of learned men, but was also composed of several squabbling kingdoms with a low life expectancy for kings. As the manager of the palace school, Alcuin taught many young men who would become leading scholars, including Einhard, who would write a biography of Charles in his retirement near the end of Louis the Pious's reign. There appears to have been a genuine bond between the two men, although Charles did not listen to Alcuin's advice to avoid using the threat of death to encourage conversions. Aside from this minor disagreement, Charles relied heavily on Alcuin's advice and rewarded him for that advice, granting him 5 wealthy abbeys, making Alcuin one of the richest men in the kingdom. This wealth gave him the time to write extensively about the virtue of poverty. As the number of scholars increased, some remained in the court, but others were sent to oversee bishoprics and abbeys. Frequent contact with each other revealed the problem of discrepancies between religious writing in different regions. In some cases, these discrepancies were caused by different thinking, which would be later described as heresy. But the key problem was actually grammar. Latin was the language of scholars, a holdover from the Roman Empire. When the empire still functioned, there had been grammar schools in large towns that taught young men the same grammar based on standard textbooks. However, the standard Latin grammar taught across the Western Roman Empire had disappeared as the empire fell apart. Following the collapse of the empire, the emphasis on standardization disappeared. To be clear, this disappearance was not intentional, just there was less contact between scribes from different regions, so they gradually adopted their own linguistic traditions, which they passed on to their students. It would be an overstatement to describe these variations as dialects, but it became increasingly hard for scholars to understand each other's Latin. While this may appear to be pedantic snobbery, these variations mattered because Latin was the shared written language in the Christian region. Realizing that it was a problem if his scholars could not talk to each other, Charles authorized the introduction of a new linguistic curriculum that would become standard in his lands. Given the expansion of his kingdom, this curriculum would be very influential. The standardization project was guided largely by Peter of Pisa and Alcuin of York, although it involved numerous scholars who undoubtedly quarreled with each other over who deserved credit. Still, Alcuin probably played a critical role due to his background in Northumbria, where he had been taught by Irish monks who had learned Latin as a foreign language, so they had produced a number of grammatical teaching texts. Scholars based in Italy would have grown up with Latin and naturally had a greater familiarity with the language, but had little experience teaching it to non-native Latin speakers, which would have described much of the Frankish kingdom. While the new curriculum relied on the teaching texts that had survived from the Roman period, new material was introduced to help non-native Latin speakers. Okay. A new standard Latin was developed, along with certified teaching materials. So, what happened next? Well, there was little point in introducing a standard Latin if all of the existing works in Latin were in a confusing mix of linguistic variation. The only solution was to copy the related religious texts. However, they went further and copied massive quantities of classical Roman texts, regardless of the topic. The scope of the project is difficult to comprehend today, and it is doubtful that Charles or even the project leaders had ever received a PowerPoint presentation listing the number of texts copied, the distribution of texts, and the number of texts remaining to be copied. Much of the copying was conducted by individual monasteries under the direction of their respective abbots, who had a great deal of discretion. Each abbot could authorize the copying of whichever text was available or was simply interesting, which may explain why the love poems of Catullus made the cut. Maybe the poetry helped a lonely abbot get through the cold winter nights. Actually, since there was no master list of texts to be copied or even a record of the debates over which texts were worth the considerable expenditure, we do not actually know which texts were lost. However, we do know that very few texts survive that were not copied by Carolingian scribes. The name Carolingian Renaissance is not entirely accurate, although it does sound nice. The real Renaissance was a period of genuine interest in the Greek and Latin classics, which sparked a vibrant thinking that advanced society. The Carolingian Renaissance ignored Greek, possibly because there were fewer scholars comfortable in Greek, but probably because this project had been started to strengthen the Latin Church in the Frankish Empire, even though the papacy played little, if any, role. Expanding the project to include Greek translations would have made it easier for the next generation of Frankish scholars to interact with the Eastern Empire, which was viewed as a rival. This process began in the 780s but continued over decades. The organization of the grammar was the work of a few dozen scholars at most, but the large-scale production of copies of texts was performed by many abbeys and monasteries. In addition, the confusing mixture of scripts was replaced by a standard script that became known as the Carolingian minuscule, which would inspire the early printers of the Renaissance. The Carolingian minuscule mattered because it was smaller and could be written faster than previous styles. Since parchment was insanely expensive and handwritten books already required long hours, this new minuscule significantly reduced the cost of each book. The monasteries and abbeys could afford the cost of feeding the scribes and, more important, the vellum they wrote on, because Charles had declared that people pay a tithe to their local religious establishment. So, 10% of all collected tax revenue went to the church. Naturally, people avoided paying taxes in general, which was not difficult since there was little surplus production because people were trying not to starve, but it must have been a huge amount of money for the time. The northern monasteries became centers of learning under Charles and his successors because the existing centers of learning in Aquitaine, Provence, and Burgundy had been destroyed by Charles's father and grandfather in their wars of conquest. To be clear, they had not deliberately tried to eradicate the rich culture. They just did not care. Once the northern monasteries became stable and well-funded, they began producing many new books and copies of original texts. The results of this massive increase in copying of existing texts are evident today. Roughly 1,800 Latin manuscripts produced during the first 800 years of Christianity survive today, while more than 7,000 from the 9th century have survived. This accomplishment is more impressive than it appears at first glance. Having monks spend their days copying texts was probably the least expensive part of the process. The scriptorium of Saint-Martin at Tours produced a minimum of 2 Bibles each year, and the parchment needed to produce a single Bible required the slaughter of several hundred sheep. Admittedly, the Bible is a very big book, and the majority of works were far smaller. It is difficult to evaluate the average production capacity of monks, but a scribe named Agambert left a note at the end of a commentary that he had completed it in 34 days, producing 11 pages per day on average. To sum up, the massive expansion of the kingdom required an improved system of local government. So Charles divided each newly conquered region into counties. The counts were not feudal landowners, but royal appointees, responsible for collecting taxes, administering justice, and raising troops for campaigns. The kingdom included several different cultures, each with its own legal tradition. So Charles gathered leading scholars to produce a standard legal system. The wealth of Charles's court attracted scholars from all over Europe, and when it became clear that they could barely understand each other's Latin, Charles authorized the introduction of a new linguistic curriculum that would become standard in his lands. There was little point in introducing a standard Latin if all of the existing works in Latin were a confusing mix of linguistic variation, so the court funded a project to copy a huge number of classical Roman texts. Meanwhile, there was a new emir in Al-Andalus who saw an opportunity, since the Franks had moved most of their army far east. I will discuss the sudden invasion of Aquitaine next episode. Unfortunately, the next episode will be uploaded 3 weeks from now, but the series will return to its weekly schedule afterwards. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.